Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology. So in our first video, we're going to talk about an introduction to anatomy and physiology as well as homeostasis. So what is the difference between anatomy and physiology? Well, anatomy is the study of the structure of the human body. So knowing the parts of the body and where they're located, knowing the bones, the muscles, and the different organs. Whereas physiology is the study of the function of the human body. So this would be like, what do the parts do? What is their job in the body and how do those mechanisms work? Now, anatomy is kind of like the memorization piece, whereas physiology is more of a complicated process that you need to learn and understand. The structure of a body part is often very closely related to its function or what it does. So, looking at the pictures on this page, they're types of epithelial tissue, which could be like skin cells or cells that line different organs. Now, the one on the left, the structure of it is flat and thin. So these cells allow materials to pass easily through them. So that way, the function allowing things to pass through them is associated with the structure of being thin. Whereas the other picture shows a thicker cell. Now, these cells actually have materials in them and secrete materials. So the structure of it being thicker is related to the function of secreting different materials. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the history of anatomy and physiology. So anatomy and physiology is the oldest scientific discipline of medicine. Let's talk about 1600 BCE. In Egypt, they knew very little about the function of anatomy, so they didn't know physiology, but they were able to look at body parts and see their associations. Anatomy wasn't banned by the church at this time, but social authorities rejected dissection. It just didn't seem right at that time. Now let's look at 1300 CE. Leonardo da Vinci created anatomical sketches, and you can see the examples of those sketches are very detailed. Now, the Murder Act of 1752 is when murderers were executed by hangings. Now, after the hangings, the bodies were used for dissection. And it was actually a public event that people would go to, and they would be able to watch dissections of murderers. Pretty crazy. There were actually theaters. And you can see that in the picture on the right side, theaters that people went to watch this publicly. Now, eventually, there weren't enough murderers, apparently. They didn't have enough bodies, so people started body snatching, and also known as grave robbing. So that became a bit of a problem. We didn't want that to be going on, so then came the Anatomy Act of 1832. And that's when people finally decided that, hey, let's have dissection of donated bodies, people that are giving their bodies to science and are saying this is okay. All right, let's get on to the levels of organization in the body. So we're going from smallest to largest. Now you have a sheet that you either have printed out or you can have on Notability where you can write these things in, and that will be on the next slide. So I'm going to talk about them first. We have the atom. An example would be like the hydrogen atom, lithium atom, okay? Next comes the molecule, which is a bit bigger, such as a water molecule has 2 hydrogen and an oxygen, okay, or a large glucose molecule. The next step up is macromolecule. We talked about those in biology, so like a protein or DNA, okay? Then comes the organelles, like the mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, the nucleus. Next up is the cell. We're getting larger. We have muscle cells, nerve cells, etc. We'll talk about different cells of the body. Next is the tissue. Epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle, and nerve are the 4 types, and we will talk about those in detail in our next video. Then we go to organs, skin, A bone is an organ, so the femur, the heart, the kidney, they're all organs. Now, all of those organs belong to an organ system, like the skeletal system, digestive system. There's many different systems. And lastly, to put everything together, we have an organism, such as a human or a cat or a dog. Okay, and now here's that picture that shows you that visually. You can feel free to go ahead and label them. Now, I didn't include subatomic particles because we're not talking about that. All right. Okay, our organ systems, let's go over all of them. We have the integumentary system. That is the skin. The skin itself is the largest organ in the body. Then we have skeletal system, the muscular system, nervous system, endocrine system, which works with hormones, cardiovascular system, the heart and blood vessels, lymphatic system, which is part of your immunity, helps out with that, digestive system, respiratory system, urinary system, and then the reproductive systems. Okay, now we're on to homeostasis. Homeostasis is maintaining a stable internal environment or an equilibrium in the body. Okay, so changes are going to happen in the body or in the environment, and we need to keep stability. It's very important. Ultimately, the cause of death of anyone is a irreversible loss of homeostasis. If someone were to go and cut off your arm and you bled to death, ultimately your body wasn't in a stable equilibrium, and ultimately that is the cause of death of anyone, is homeostasis. Of course, we get more specific with causes of death. But let's talk about homeostatic control mechanisms. So they monitor the internal environment and correct as needed, because we need those corrections to work properly in order to live. Our variations for where those limits can go have limits, and we need to stay within those limits at all times. Here are the three parts of the homeostatic control mechanisms. So first you have the receptor. Receptors receive information that the environment has changed, like temperature has changed or your blood pressure has changed. Okay? Now that information from the receptor goes to the control center, which is the brain. The brain receives and processes that message from the receptor, and it also has a certain set point of, whatever it is, whether it's your internal body temperature, has a specific set point that it needs to be within. Okay? Lastly, the control center then sends information to the effectors, which are going to cause a response to get that change, get those conditions back to normal in the internal environment in the body. Now, the effectors are often the muscles and the glands. Okay, we'll talk about some examples.